Section 2.3, Amazon Aurora's Endpoints and Replication. In this section, I'll touch on Amazon Aurora's endpoints and add some additional information on Amazon Aurora's replication. You connect to the instances of an Aurora database cluster by using one of several endpoints for a database cluster. An endpoint is made up of a domain name and a port separated by a colon. The example on this screenshot is dbcluster.id.clster-cys-west-2.rds.amazon-aws.com:3306. There are three endpoints to choose from to connect to, and which one you choose should best fit your particular scenario. The first way you can connect to your Aurora database cluster is through the cluster endpoint. The cluster endpoint connects you to the primary instance for the database cluster, where you can perform read and write operations. The primary instance also has its unique endpoint, the instance endpoint. The difference between these two endpoints is that the cluster endpoint will always point to the current primary instance. I'll discuss instance endpoints in more detail in a subsequent slide. For high availability scenarios, it's recommended to connect to the cluster endpoint. If you do, your application will reconnect to the new primary instance once failover is complete. During a failover, Aurora continues to serve requests to the cluster endpoint from the newly promoted primary instance as that replicates the failed instance. Aurora serves the cluster endpoint with minimal interruption of service. As an example of how to use cluster endpoints, consider an Aurora database cluster with two Aurora replicas in different availability zones from its primary instance. By connecting to the cluster endpoint, you can send both read and write traffic to the primary instance. You can also connect to the endpoint for each Aurora replica and send queries directly to those database instances. In the unlikely event that the primary instance or the availability zone that contains the primary instance fails, then Amazon RDS will promote one of the Aurora replicas to be the new primary instance and update the domain name service record for the cluster endpoint to point to the new primary instance. Your application will continue to send read and write traffic to your Aurora database cluster by using the cluster endpoint with minimal interruption in service. Each Aurora database cluster has a reader endpoint that you can use to connect to one of the Aurora replicas in your cluster. The reader endpoint load balances connections across all the replicas available in the cluster. Note that the reader endpoint only load balances connections. If you want to load balance queries to distribute the read workload for a cluster, you'll have to manage that in your application. You can use the reader endpoint to provide high availability for your read-only queries from your database cluster. You accomplish this by placing multiple replicas in different availability zones and connect to the reader endpoint for your read workload. If an availability zone failure occurs, your application will continue to send read traffic to the Aurora replicas in your cluster using the reader endpoint with minimal interruption of service. If a failover occurs and the Aurora replica that you're connected to is promoted to the primary instance, your connection will be dropped. In order to continue sending your read workload to the other replicas in the cluster, you need to reconnect to the reader endpoint. We'll revisit this concept to give more clarity in a subsequent video in this video chapter 2.0 on Amazon Aurora architecture. During a failover, the reader endpoint might direct connections to the primary instance for the cluster for a short time when an Aurora replica is promoted to the primary instance. The primary instance and Aurora replicas in a database cluster all have an instance endpoint, which is a unique endpoint that you can use to connect directly to the specific instance. Instance endpoints don't include cluster in the identifier. For example, the cluster endpoint might be db cluster id.cluster-cywrop3ux2jcx.us-2.rds.amazonaws.com:3306, and the instance endpoint for the primary instance might be kimcluster-us-west-2a.cyrop3ux2jcx.us-2.rds.amazonaws.com:3306. There's no word cluster in that second endpoint. You can configure multiple clients to different Aurora replicas in an Aurora database cluster to distribute read workloads for your application. However, for high availability workloads, it's best to place replicas in separate availability zones to ensure your application can still read data from your cluster if an availability zone fails. Therefore, rather than connecting to the instance endpoint, consider using the cluster endpoint or the reader endpoint for the cluster. If a failover occurs for the database cluster, the cluster endpoint can be used to connect to the newly promoted primary instance, and the reader endpoint can be used to connect to any available Aurora replica in the database cluster. To end this video section, there's a couple more points to touch on in regard to Amazon Aurora's replication. Aurora replicas are independent endpoints in an Aurora database cluster, best used for scaling read operations and increasing availability. Up to 15 Aurora replicas can be distributed across the availability zones that a database cluster spans within a region. Although the database cluster volume is made up of multiple copies of the data for the database cluster, the data in the cluster volume is represented as a single logical volume to the primary instance and to Aurora replicas in the database cluster. As a result, all Aurora replicas return the same data for query results with minimal replica lag, usually much less than 100 milliseconds after the primary instance has written an update. Replica lag varies depending on the rate of database change. For example, during periods where a large amount of write operations occur for the database, you might see a bit of an increase in replica lag. We'll revisit this topic in the video section on Amazon Aurora I/O in this Architecture 2.0 series. Quiz time for section 2.3. Amazon Aurora's Endpoints and Replication. Question: what is the recommended and safest endpoint to connect to your database cluster? A. Instance endpoints, because they allow direct connection to the replicas. B. Reader endpoints, to be safe during a failover. C. Reader endpoints, to ensure load balancing across read replicas. D. Cluster endpoints, because your application will reconnect to the new primary instance once failover is complete. Answer: D. Cluster endpoints, because your application will reconnect to the new primary instance once failover is complete. Explanation: during a failover, Aurora continues to serve requests to the cluster endpoint from the newly promoted primary instance as that replaces the failed instance. Aurora serves the cluster endpoint with minimal interruption of service. This concludes section 2.3, Understanding Amazon Aurora's Endpoints and Replication. Coming up next is section 2.4, Understanding Amazon Aurora's Logging, Storage, Caching, and Indexing.